Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and finance. This week, democracy, peace and economic prosperity. Myanmar's opening up to the world, but who's winning the battle to rebuild the country? We talked to ASEAN's Secretary General about Myanmar, plus the territorial disputes in the South China Sea and the financial crisis. And they're on the road to peace in the Philippines. But what will be the dividend from peace in the South? We'll also look at Europe a little later in the broadcast, but our first part is all Asia, in particular ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Probably heard of this, a 10-nation group. Brunei, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand and Vietnam. And with that sort of economic firepower, all those countries together, you could say it has the potential to one day challenge the likes of maybe even the European Union. Think about it. Currently, ASEAN is a $2 trillion economy, with a total population of 600 million people. Definitely a long way to go when you consider the size of the European Union economy. That's $16 trillion. But remember, it took China a generation to get to where it is now, the world's second biggest economy. But Southeast Asia is a very fractious region. There's territorial disputes in the oil and gas-rich South China Sea. That's made big headlines recently. But things like corruption, mismanagement, internal conflicts, they've formed big parts of the landscape too. So here's what we've got for you this week for our look around Southeast Asia. An interview with Surin Pitsuwan, who's the Secretary General of ASEAN. Also a look at the possible peace deal in the southern Philippines and the economic impact of that. We'll do that with Philip McNicholas from Fitch Ratings. But we're starting in Myanmar, a state ASEAN members have worked pretty hard to bring in from the cold. The thing is that the rewards right now seem to be heading the way of China and Japan. Tokyo, for example, has already agreed to waive billions of dollars in debt, and is helping Myanmar pay back other loans as well. With more on all of that, Wayne Hay.
If all goes to plan, this will be the largest industrial estate in Southeast Asia. Located in southern Myanmar, the Dawei Special Economic Zone will cover more than 200 square kilometres. But the price tag of $50 billion was too much for the Thai developers to find. Enter the Japan and Thai governments, who have arranged loans to rescue a project its supporters say is desperately needed to help Myanmar's economy. Unlike many other nations, Japan didn't impose financial sanctions against the previous military regime. Its past dealings with the important players in Myanmar mean it's well placed to take advantage now that the country is opening up.
Japanese is the biggest lender in Myanmar, so of course right now they have a very close relationship with the government. The second one, they want to use Southeast Asia as a base, so they have no choice to invest in Myanmar anyway.
Japan is already the largest investor in neighbouring Thailand. The biggest names from car and motorbike manufacturing to electronics have factories here. Those companies are also likely to enter Myanmar on the back of an $18 billion Japanese investment and aid package. A large chunk of that money will go towards building industrial zones. The Thais are confident Japan's big business won't desert them.
I don't think Myanmar will become Thailand's competitor, but will instead complement our economy. And I don't think that foreign investors, especially the Japanese, will move from Thailand to Myanmar, because Myanmar still lacks infrastructure like steady electricity, labor skills, a standard banking system, and so on.
But that's exactly what the likes of the Japanese want to help them with, and at the same time have the edge in the race to make money out of Myanmar.
So what does ASEAN think about that? Well, we got the word right from the top when our business editor Abid Ali sat down with the Secretary General of ASEAN, Surin Pitsuwan, on the sidelines of the Inside Investor Forum Asia here in Doha. He began by asking if ASEAN nations were being sidestepped as Myanmar opened up its economy to the world.
I think it's an open space. Definitely countries like Japan and China. China is next to it, and probably the longest border that Myanmar has with anybody is with China. China has with anybody is with Myanmar. So it's next door. Japan has been working on Southeast Asia since the early 60s. So it's natural that Japan would be ready to look for opportunities, both in terms of natural resources and manufacturing. The market is big enough. If it grows, if the purchasing power grows, definitely it's a good market. So, but But all the ASEAN countries are also, trying to help Myanmar to put its house in order, to create market mechanisms, currency exchange regimes, law, investment law, these things. So it's an open field, and I think Myanmar has to pick and choose who will be the best partners in what sector of the economic development that they're going to pursue. I don't think any country is going to be exclusive in trying to access into Myanmar. And Myanmar will be more pragmatic than that, than to have just one country dominating everything. So it'll pick and choose. It'll play a balancing game.
There's been a lot of territorial disputes, in particular in the South China Sea. Is there a mechanism within ASEAN how you can deal with China?
We are working on South China Sea, and we've been working on this for the last 10 years. 2002, we came up with what we call the Declaration of the Conduct over the South China Sea. It's a political statement expressing collective political will between China and the 10 ASEAN countries that we will be working to resolve this problem, but before that we will be restrained from open conflict, from using military power, but will rely on diplomatic and peaceful means.
Is it truly about territorial, or is it something deeper? Oil? Is that what's at the heart of this?
It comes as a package. You can't say that it's just territory, but it's what it stands for. When you have extended territory over the water, whatever underneath, living or non-living resources are also important.
The influence of nations like your neighbours, China in particular, in ASEAN has become a real issue. How do you handle those different influences within the group?
ASEAN is dialogue partner to Japan, Korea, China, India, Australia, New Zealand. So the whole region is under this umbrella called the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, TAC, and it binds everyone to work together peacefully on any differences that we may have. So far, dialogue partners have respected the way in which ASEAN handles these differences, balancing. Yeah.
So I want to talk about Europe, but I want to start with your own experiences during the Asia financial crisis. You were the foreign minister for Thailand, and I just want to know, what was your conversations like with the IMF and other organisations as you tried to get a grip on that?
So we look at the way in which the IMF is behaving in relation to European countries and the American companies and corporations. We look at it and we said, the conversation or the prescription are much different from what you have prescribed to us back in late 90s and early 2000. Now companies and corporations, banks are too big to fail. They cannot be allowed to fail, and you have to spend the money in order to generate, in order to stimulate your economies. Those were not available for us. So we went through it in a very difficult way. But because of that, we came through. By 2003, we were producing, we were growing bigger than 1996, before the crisis. And when Europe went into its own crisis, 2008, we can't say that we were decoupled, not affected, but we stood rather strongly against any heavy or major blow.
Would you consider a single currency?
No. The prospect in Europe, the example in Europe has not been too encouraging. We are not a union, even less of a union than the EU. So the example in the EU, what happened in the EU is that you have monetary union, but you don't have the mechanism to really monitor and control each economic performance, economic unit. ASEAN is even less of a union. It's a community. We can't contemplate single currency. Although we have set up something called the contingency fund among ourselves, $240 billion US dollars. That's ASEAN 10 plus China, Japan, Korea, for an emergency situation that one economy might want to turn to each other in the region rather than go directly to IMF. That $240 billion US dollars is a mechanism of confidence to ourselves, among ourselves, and to the world, that East Asia knows what it is doing, that we have set aside a pool of resources so that we can help each other. So that kind of thing is something that we are improvising in order to avoid the kind of experiences that Europe and we ourselves have experienced back in late 90s.
And from there we move to the Philippines, where a 4-decade-old conflict that's cost more than 200,000 lives could be drawing to a peaceful conclusion. The government and the MILF, the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, have agreed to the creation of a new autonomous region in the south of the country, a place where Muslims have often complained about the lack of growth and investment. And not only that, there's a wealth of mineral deposits in the region too, meaning peace has many implications. Jamela Alandogan has more.
The agreement creates a new political entity called Bangsamoro. The MILF will share political control of the region and its mineral resources with the national government. The Philippines has some of the world's richest deposits of gold, copper, and chromite. And while most parts of the country have had their share of mining development, companies have shied away from the conflict-ridden Moro areas. The Philippine Chamber of Commerce says countries in the Middle East are interested in investing in the region once the peace agreement is fully implemented. The economic expectations from this framework agreement are high, but many remain skeptical. It may be some time before the Bangsamoros themselves experience the benefits of financial investments. The fighting in the south has driven away investors for so long. This region is one of the poorest in the country. It is also the most lawless. For decades, warlords and political clans have controlled most of the resources, and that will make it even more difficult to transfer control of those resources to the MILF.
The concentrations of the MILF was fighting against the government, but doing reform in terms of addressing political dynasties, traditional politicians, and warlordism was not, I think, the cup of tea of the MILF in the past. So with the new agreement, I think the MILF would now have to face this new reality of addressing these internal contradictions.
President Aquino insists that there will be a peaceful transition of power and that a just and lasting peace in the south is achievable. But until then, the struggle of the Bangsamoros for their future remains uncertain.
So we're going to zero in further on the Philippines now, and to do that we've got Philip McNicholas joining us from Hong Kong. Philip's the director of Fitch Ratings there. So let's talk through, Philip, what's going on in the Philippines at the moment, or perhaps really I should start with, what has been going on in the Philippines. How would you categorize the strength of the economy there up until this point?
Well, the Philippines economy at the moment has been undergoing a period of sustained strong domestic demand that's helping to buffer it against a weakened external environment. In particular, you've had a pickup in both private and public consumption expenditures, as well as investment-led growth within that. And that's sort of keeping things going as it stands. And we expect this year the economy will record 5.5% full-year GDP growth. And then carry over that momentum into next year, where we expect 5% GDP growth.
So it weathered the whole global economic crisis pretty well then, or at least better than other countries and regions did?
Well, it's a much more domestically focused economy, so it was less immediately impacted by the downturn in global trade in 2008, although it did record much more subdued growth in 2008 and 2009. Right now, because of those strong domestic drivers, that is helping to insulate it against, or at least buffer it against, the weakness in the US and the UK and the EU economies.
Okay, so that brings us to this point now where we could be looking at a peace deal in the south of the country, certainly the beginnings of it. Two issues there, I guess. One is the vast mineral wealth which is untapped in that region, and I will ask you about that in a moment. First, I just want to look at this, the broader idea that if there is a hint of peace, it's got to be good for just, encouraging business to come back. The violence must have been putting people off until now.
Well, for a long time, the investment climate in the Philippines has been a bit of a deterrent for foreign investors. Since the beginning of the Aquino administration, there's been an overt effort to improve the business climate and also just the way of doing business domestically. That's helped feed the domestic confidence that's fueling the investment-led growth at the moment, as well as the idea of peace in Mindanao certainly does have broader implications for the investment environment. In particular, should it be successful, you would potentially be looking at a reduced cost of doing business, particularly in Mindanao, where security considerations would be much less, and also issues over political risks would also decrease. This would obviously have potential to filter through to the rest of the economy and be beneficial even for, say, Luzon or Visayas, by attracting foreign investors that may have been concerned that there could be spillover to those areas.
Especially if they get digging into the ground and find exactly what's under there. I mean, what is the extent of this potential mineral wealth there, and what could it do for the Philippines economy if it can really be tapped?
Well, I mean, the mining sector is an obvious starting point, given the current focus on commodities in the broader economy. There's estimations of, I believe, somewhere around about 300 billion worth of untapped mineral reserves in Mindanao alone, which is quite a sizable chunk, I'm sure you'll agree. But it's not the only part of Mindanao that can be developed. In particular, the area affected by this 4-decade-old conflict has a GDP per capita of a quarter of the level of the national average, which means there's a lot of potential upside, not just for mining, but for broader economic development. And I'd also point out that any sort of mining project is a multi-year, longer-term project that actually takes a long time to filter through to broader spillovers. Where you'd see more immediate gains is things like improved public infrastructure, just by virtue of, say, roads, and even greater security for people in general. So that's where you'd see the first economic benefits if a peace accord was able to be nailed down. So the mining sector is obviously a big story here, but it's just part of an even bigger story and greater potential for the region and the country as a whole.
Yes, so from the way you're describing it, it sounds like there is plenty of opportunity for building, for work, for jobs. Could that actually encourage people to perhaps come back to the Philippines? I'm just thinking, the amount of expats, the amount of Filipinos who come to places, actually like here, the Gulf, to work and then send money back as remittances. Is there any sort of lure, if there is peace in our time, that people would come back?
Well, sure, that's always a possibility, but again, that takes time to develop. And you have a lot of Filipinos entering the job market every year, and it is a question as to whether or not the economy as a whole can create suitably skilled jobs for these people. There's always going to be opportunities overseas, but the government's potential to create more innovative, higher skilled jobs that keep those skilled Filipinos in the country, it certainly would be enhanced by this potential accord. Particularly, as I said, if you get foreign investors and even domestic investors more willing to place their money not just in Mindanao but in the country as a whole.
All right, Philip McNicholas from Fitch Ratings. Pleasure talking to you. Thanks for joining us on Counting the Cost. And still ahead on Counting the Costs, the oil spill, the oil giant, and exactly who has to clean it all up. More on Shell and the Nigerian farmers a little bit later. Just a quick look at Europe now. We had Angela Merkel making a brief visit to Greece, probably more symbolic than anything else, but the real focus is on Madrid as it inches towards a bailout. Now, the International Monetary Fund expects Spain's economy to shrink a further 1.3% next year. It'll extend the country's recession. And the credit ratings agency Standard & Poor's cut Madrid's rating to near junk levels. But the big issue is still unemployment. And as things like Spanish building projects, for example, close down, workers are now crossing the border to France to look for jobs. Jackie Rowland went to find them and their stories.
It's shortly after dawn, and Spanish labourers are heading over the border to spend the day on building sites in France. The traffic is very much one way. On the Spanish side of the border, work has almost dried up.
This is what the European Union is meant to be all about, the free movement of people, goods and services. Well, that might work when the economy is going well, but at times of crisis, the old protectionism kicks in.
In the French border town of Sayagouz, vans with Spanish licence plates are everywhere. French builders complain that the foreign competition is stealing their business. A French labourer earns $15 an hour. A Spaniard will work for 10.
For French businesses, it's terrible. The work we have here is enough for our companies. Unfortunately, there are lots of Spanish companies here working under what conditions we don't know. That's harming our companies in France.
Denis Casamijana is putting the final touches to a new house in Sayagouz. Unemployment in the town stands at 14%. With so much labour coming over from Spain, he says he may have to lay off his French workers.
The French state has betrayed us. It's a betrayal, quite simply. We pay charges, we pay taxes, we're hemorrhaging work, and nobody says anything.
Ignacio Delgado is a Spanish contractor who's registered on both sides of the border. He's building this house for Spanish clients. He finds it completely normal that Spanish companies should work in France and vice versa.
Before, I knew many French people who worked in Spain. Now, of course, construction work there has decreased a lot. So if there is work close to Spain on the French side, then we're obliged to go for it.
From the point of view of this border town, it's hard to see the benefits of being in the Eurozone right now. What people here care about is French jobs for French workers.
To Africa now, in a classic David and Goliath style battle in Nigeria. It's a group of Nigerian farmers actually taking on the oil giant Shell, which they say caused environmental damage through oil spills in the Niger Delta. Now, they want the company held accountable, they want it to clean it up too, but Shell says it's people stealing oil who are to blame. This from Yvonne Ndege in Nigeria.
Nigerian fish farmers taking the Dutch-owned oil giant Shell to court in the Netherlands. They accuse Shell of causing oil spills that have devastated their fish farms and destroyed their livelihoods back home. The case is being heard here and not in Nigeria because Shell has its headquarters here. This is just some of the damage the farmers accuse Shell of causing. They say that broken and poorly maintained pipelines and other infrastructure has caused large quantities of oil to seep into what were once rich fishing waters. They say it's affected millions of people. Getting the case heard in the Netherlands is a historic legal victory for the people of this oil-rich community. They have faced 4 years of legal hurdles to get the Dutch judicial system to investigate Shell for the pollution it's accused of causing abroad. Friends of the Earth, which is representing farmers in court, says Shell must be held accountable for the oil spills.
Today, I believe history is being made. Stopping Shell against the atrocity, making them to clean up the disaster, the oil spills and impact they have committed in the Niger Delta over the years, that it is time they own up to their responsibilities.
Shell argues that the oil spills are caused when their pipelines and installations are sabotaged to feed the hundreds of illegal oil refineries in the area.
We had a case of pollution through sabotage that we went in, that we cleaned up and did what we needed to do. That there is, at this juncture, still pollution in the area, we confirm, we believe that's the case. However, the current pollution is not as a consequence of the initial sabotage, which we remediated.
A verdict in the case against Shell in the Netherlands is expected at the end of this year. If the company is found liable, it could be forced to clean up the oil spills and pay compensation to the Nigerian farmers. Yvonne Ndege, Al Jazeera, Abuja, Nigeria.
And that is where we'll leave you for this week. If you want to get in touch with the show, though, here's how you do it. Twitter's the easiest way. Either me at Kamal AJE or our business editor at Abid Oliver Ali. Email address is there at the bottom of your screen as well. Counting the cost at altazero.net if you don't use Twitter. We've also got altazero.com/business. That is where you can link on to the CTC page, and all our episodes are up there in full for you to catch up on whenever you would like. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.